They say a man's life flashes before his eyes when he dies. For Damian Rousseau, the death blow came 3 days before his wedding. He was supposed to marry the daughter of an allied syndicate, a transaction sealed in blood and vintage champagne. He had everything controlled, calculated, cold, until a dropped piece of paper led him to the crumbling apartment of his quietest maid. He nudged her broken door open, expecting a thief. What he found instead forced him to burn his own empire to the ground. The ice in Damian's glass cracked. It was the only sound in the sprawling dining room that felt real. Across the mahogany table, Victoria was dissecting the seating chart for their wedding reception. She wore a silk dress the color of bruised plums, her manicured finger tapping against the heavy parchment. Victoria didn't speak with affection. She spoke in logistics. The Rossi family needed to be seated far from the Calabrese underbosses. The mayor's table required an unobstructed view of the head table to ensure the press caught the right angles. It was a merger, a corporate acquisition handled with shotguns and tailored suits. Damian took a slow drink of his scotch. It burned going down, but it didn't thaw the knot in his chest. "You aren't listening," Victoria said. She didn't look up from her list. "I am," Damian replied. His voice was a low, gravelly hum. "Keep the mayor away from the journalists. Put my uncle near the exits." She finally raised her eyes. They were sharp, intelligent, and entirely devoid of warmth. They understood each other perfectly. Love was a liability neither could afford. This wedding would cement Damian's control over the eastern seaboard, absorbing Victoria's familial territories without firing a single shot. It was smart. It was necessary. It felt like walking into a vault and pulling the heavy steel door shut behind him. "I have to go," Damian said, setting the glass down. Victoria didn't argue. She simply nodded, already back to her parchment. Damian left the dining room, walking through the cavernous hallways of his estate. The walls were lined with art he didn't understand, bought by interior decorators to project a lineage of wealth that didn't exist. 2 generations ago, his grandfather was breaking legs on the docks. Now Damian wore a Patek Philippe and bled people in soundproof basements. He took the hidden stairwell down to the lower levels. The air grew cooler, thicker. The scent of ozone and copper hit his nose before he even reached the reinforced steel door. Inside, his lieutenant, Frank, was washing his hands at a stainless steel sink. The chair in the center of the room was empty now, but the concrete floor beneath it was slick and dark. "He talked," Frank said, drying his hands on a rough towel. "Gave up the warehouse in Brooklyn. We're moving on it tonight. Clean this up," Damian ordered, looking at the pool of dark liquid creeping towards the drain. "Already called her," Frank said. Damian turned. Walking down the corridor with a heavy plastic bucket and a mop was Sophie. She wore a grey uniform that swallowed her slight frame. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, utilitarian bun. She didn't look at Frank. She didn't look at Damian. She just kept her eyes on the floor, the heavy soles of her orthopedic shoes squeaking faintly against the concrete. Damian lingered in the doorway. He watched her work. He had dozens of staff in the estate, mostly invisible, keeping the sprawling machine running. But Sophie was different. She was the one they called for the messes that couldn't be explained to the normal cleaning crew. She never asked questions. She never flinched. She poured a heavy dose of industrial bleach over the blood. The chemical smell instantly assaulted the room, masking the metallic stench of violence. She dropped the mop into the puddle. Her hands were red, the knuckles raw and split. She pushed the mop with a steady, rhythmic motion. No hesitation, no disgust. Damian watched the muscles in her forearms flex. There was a desperate kind of strength in her movements. Most people would vomit, or tremble, or quit after their first night in the basement. Sophie just scrubbed harder. "Ah, she's a ghost," Frank muttered, stepping out into the hall beside Damian. "Pays no mind to nothing." Damian didn't reply. He watched her wring out the mop. As she bent over the bucket, Something slipped from the pocket of her oversized uniform. A small, crumpled piece of paper fluttered to the dry concrete. She didn't notice. She hoisted the heavy bucket, the muscles in her neck straining, and walked toward the utility closet at the far end of the room. Damien walked over to where she had been standing. He bent down and picked up the paper. It was a final billing notice from a pediatric respiratory clinic in Queens. The amount due was staggering. Over $40,000. Written across the top in red ink was a single word. Final. Damien stared at it. He dealt in leverage. Information was currency, and everyone had a price. But looking at the brutal, unfeeling numbers on this piece of cheap paper, he felt a strange, hollow pull. This wasn't a gambling debt. It wasn't a bribe. It was a weight crushing someone who scrubbed his sins off the floor in total silence. He folded the notice and slid it into the breast pocket of his bespoke jacket. Sleep wouldn't come. It hadn't come in weeks. Damien stood on the balcony of his master bedroom, a cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers. The sprawling lawns of the estate were drenched in a cold, relentless rain. In 48 hours, 500 guests would flood these grounds. Victoria would wear white, the bishop would bless their union, flashbulbs would blind them, capturing the picture-perfect image of two dynasties merging. He felt entirely hollow. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded medical bill. It had been gnawing at him since the afternoon. He was a man who lived by logic, by ruthless pragmatism. Caring about a maid's financial troubles was a luxury a man in his position couldn't afford. It was a weakness. But as he stared out into the dark, suffocating wealth of his property, he needed an escape. He needed to breathe air that didn't smell like money and deceit. Damien crushed the cigarette out on the stone railing. He didn't wake Frank. He walked down to the garage, bypassed the sleek black SUVs, and took the keys to an older, unassuming sedan he kept for moving undetected. The drive to Queens took 40 minutes. The rain slicked the highways, reflecting the smeared neon lights of the city. He crossed the bridge, leaving the gated opulence of his world behind. The architecture shifted rapidly. Mansions turned to townhouses, which dissolved into tightly packed, crumbling apartment blocks. Astoria was asleep. The streets here were narrow, crowded with parked cars fighting for space. The gutters were overflowing with trash and rainwater. Damien parked 3 blocks away from the address on the billing notice, pulling his dark peacoat tight against the wind. He walked with his head down, the damp chill seeping through his clothes. The neighborhood smelled of wet asphalt, stale beer from a corner dive bar, and exhaust fumes. It was gritty. Real. It reminded him of the cramped 2-room apartment he grew up in before his father seized power. He found her building. It was a 5-story brick walk-up with peeling paint, and fire escapes rusted the color of dried blood. The front door's glass was webbed with cracks, held together by strips of duct tape. Damien approached the intercom panel. Half the buttons were missing. Beside 4B, the name was written in faded, smudged ink, H. Davis. The heavy metal door didn't require a key. The latch was broken, the frame warped from years of humidity and neglect. Damien pushed it open and stepped into the cramped lobby. The smell of boiling cabbage and old cigarettes hit him immediately. The fluorescent light overhead hummed angrily, flickering a sickly yellow. He took the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under his weight. With every floor he climbed, the air grew thinner, choked with the collective exhaustion of the people living behind these thin wooden doors. 4th floor. The hallway was dim, the carpet stained with years of foot traffic. He stopped in front of 4B. He didn't know what he was doing here. He was Damien Rousseau. He commanded men who leveled city blocks. He didn't make house calls to domestic staff. He reached into his coat to pull out the folded bill, intending to just slide it under the door and leave. An anonymous gesture, a rare moment of charity before he locked himself into a dead marriage. But as he knelt to slip the paper under the frame, he heard a sound. It was a cough, a wet, rattling, painful sound. It went on for a terrifyingly long time, tearing through the thin walls. Then, a voice. Soft, desperate, and laden with a bone-deep exhaustion. "I know, baby, I know. Shh, Mama's here. Breathe with me, just like the doctor showed us. In and out." Damien froze. He recognized the voice, though he had never heard her speak more than 2 words at a time. It was Sophie. The lock on the door was flimsy, a cheap deadbolt that barely caught the strike plate. The door itself was slightly ajar, warped by the dampness of the building, held open by a tiny crack. Damien didn't leave. He didn't slide the paper under. Driven by an instinct he couldn't name, he pushed his hand flat against the cheap wood and slowly, silently, opened the door a few inches wider. The apartment was barely larger than Damien's walk-in closet. The walls were painted a depressing, institutional beige, peeling at the corners where dampness had set in. There was no furniture to speak of, just a small, battered kitchen table and a sagging futon. But the room was warm. A rusted space heater glowed bright orange in the corner, fighting back the chill of the drafty windows. Sophie sat on the edge of the futon. She wasn't wearing her shapeless grey uniform. She wore a faded, oversized t-shirt and loose sweatpants. Her hair was down, falling in exhausted waves around her pale face. The severe, untouchable ghost from his basement was gone. In her place was a woman stripped down to her raw, desperate core. In her arms was a little boy. He couldn't have been older than 5. He was pale, his skin almost translucent, his small chest heaving as he fought for every breath. An oxygen tube was looped over his ears, connected to a noisy, rattling machine beside the bed. "That's it, Toby," Sophie whispered, rocking him back and forth. Her raw red hands, the same hands that scrubbed blood from Damien's floors, were stroking the boy's hair with infinite, heartbreaking tenderness. "You're doing so good. You're my brave boy." Damien stood paralyzed in the shadows of the hallway. He watched her press her forehead against the child's. He watched the way her shoulders trembled, holding back tears so the boy wouldn't see her fear. It was an intimacy so profound, so devastatingly pure, that Damien felt like he was trespassing on holy ground. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who demanded things from him, people who plotted, schemed, and killed for an extra inch of power. Here was a woman giving every ounce of her soul to keep a small set of lungs breathing, expecting absolutely nothing from the world in return. His eyes drifted away from the futon, scanning the cramped room. Above the small kitchen table, a makeshift memorial had been set up on a cheap wooden shelf. There was a flickering devotional candle, a rosary, and a framed photograph. Damien squinted through the dim light. When his eyes locked onto the face in the photo, the breath was knocked from his lungs. The heavy protective armor he had worn for a decade cracked violently down the middle. He knew the man in the picture. Jackie. Jackie had been a low-level runner for Damien's crew 5 years ago. He was a kid, really. Sloppy, nervous, always sweating. One day, the books didn't add up. 20 grand was missing from a collection down in the garment district. Damien had ordered an audit, and it led straight back to Jackie. Damien remembered the night perfectly. It was raining, much like tonight. They had dragged Jackie into the same basement Sophie now cleaned. Jackie had been weeping, begging on his knees. "Please, Mr. Russo, I didn't spend it on cards. I didn't spend it on dope. My kid, he's sick. His lungs don't work right. The insurance cut us off. I needed the cash for the machines. Please, I'll pay it back. Every dime. Just let me take care of my boy." Damien hadn't blinked. In his world, a thief was a thief. You let one slide, the whole structure collapses. Compassion was a rot that destroyed empires. He had looked at Jackie, cold and hollow, and given Frank the nod. 2 bullets to the back of the head. Problem solved. The missing money was written off as a tax of doing business. Damien had never thought about Jackie again, until now. He looked back at the boy struggling to breathe on the futon. Jackie's boy. Toby. He looked at Sophie. Jackie had begged to take care of his son, and when Damien ended his life, that impossible burden had fallen onto this woman. She was raising the child Damien had orphaned, and to pay for the machines keeping the boy alive, she was on her hands and knees scrubbing the very floor where her brother, or husband, Damien wasn't even sure, had been executed. The sheer, suffocating horror of it gripped his throat. The foundation of his entire life, the control, the calculations, the pragmatic ruthlessness, suddenly felt like a mountain of corpses he was standing on. Toby's coughing fit finally subsided into a wheezing, fragile rhythm. Sophie let out a ragged sigh, closing her eyes. She gently laid the boy down on the pillows, adjusting the oxygen tubes with practiced precision. She stood up, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve, and turned toward the door. She stopped dead. Damien hadn't moved. He was still standing in the doorway, the shadows of the hall clinging to his dark coat. Sophie didn't scream. She didn't gasp. The maternal warmth vanished from her face in a fraction of a second, replaced by the blank, dead-eyed survival mask she wore at the estate. She stepped perfectly in front of the futon, shielding the sleeping boy with her body. "Mr. Russo," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor he had just heard moments ago. My shift doesn't start until 6. Damien looked at her. He looked at the fierce, defensive set of her jaw. He looked at the framed photo of the man he killed, glowing in the candlelight over her shoulder. For the first time in his adult life, the ruthless boss of the Russo syndicate didn't know what to say. The rusted space heater in the corner of the room clicked. It was a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to shatter the thick, suffocating silence hanging between them. Damien's hand was still flat against the warped wood of the door. He felt the dampness of the cheap veneer seeping into his palm. He looked at Sophie, standing perfectly rigid between him and the sleeping child. She wasn't trembling anymore. The desperate mother he had watched through the crack in the door had vanished, retreating behind the thick, impenetrable armor she wore every time she scrubbed the blood off his basement floor. She thought he was here to kill them. The realization hit Damien with the force of a physical blow. Her eyes were wide, completely devoid of light, tracking his shoulders and his hands. She was calculating how long it would take him to draw a weapon. She was calculating if she could throw herself at him, if her small, bruised body could buy her nephew enough seconds to wake up and run. "I'm not here for him," Damien said. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. It was entirely stripped of the gravelly authority he used to command rooms of armed men. It sounded thin, weak. Sophie didn't blink. "My shift starts at 6, Mr. Russo. I haven't missed a day. I haven't spoken to anyone. I just do my job." She was negotiating for her life, reciting the terms of her invisible contract. "I stay quiet. You let us live." Damien slowly lowered his hand from the door. He reached into the inside pocket of his peacoat. He saw her chin tuck down slightly, a microscopic bracing for a gunshot. Instead, he pulled out the crumpled medical bill. He stepped fully into the room, the floorboards groaning under his expensive leather shoes, and placed the paper on the small kitchen table. Next to it sat the flickering candle and the photograph of Jackie. Jackie's smiling face mocked him in the dim light. Damien reached into his back pocket. He pulled out his money clip. It was thick with $100 bills, carried for bribes, tips, and fast escapes. He didn't count it. He dropped the entire stack of cash on top of the medical bill, over $4,000 in crisp, uncirculated currency, sitting next to a rusted space heater in a freezing apartment in Queens. It looked grotesque. It looked like an insult. "He was your brother?" Damien asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Sophie didn't look at the money. Her eyes remained locked on his chest. "Yes. He said his kid was sick when the audit happened." Damien couldn't bring himself to say the words. "When I ordered his execution." The truth was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Toby has pulmonary fibrosis, Sophie said, her voice a flat, deadened monotone. Jackie tried to get the money for the treatments. He wasn't a thief, Mr. Russo. He was just a father who ran out of options. She said it without malice. It was simply a statement of fact, a reality she had accepted long ago. The syndicate took her brother, so she took a bucket of bleach and went to work for the men who killed him, all to keep the machines running. Damien couldn't breathe. The cramped, humid air of the apartment felt like a vice closing around his throat. He looked at the boy, Toby, whose small chest rose and fell with a terrifying, rattling effort. Every breath the child took was a debt paid by a woman scrubbing the sins of monsters off a concrete floor. He had built his entire life on the belief that he was a necessary evil, that the violence he orchestrated maintained a brutal, essential order. But looking at the brutalized, surviving remnants of Jackie's family, the illusion shattered. He wasn't a king maintaining order. He was just a butcher. Damien backed away. He couldn't look at her anymore. He couldn't look at the fierce, unrelenting dignity in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words tasted like ash. They were entirely useless. He turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving the door cracked behind him. He took the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to escape the smell of boiling cabbage, old cigarettes, and desperate survival. He burst out the front door of this building into the freezing rain. The cold hit his face, but it didn't wake him up. The drive back to the estate was a blur of smeared neon and slapping windshield wipers. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was deafening, filled only with the ghost of Toby's rattling breath and the memory of Jackie begging on his knees. When he finally pulled through the massive wrought-iron gates of his property, the sun was just beginning to turn the eastern sky a bruised, angry purple. The estate loomed before him, a sprawling monument to extortion, violence, and greed. The manicured lawns, the marble fountains, the sheer, disgusting excess of it all made bile rise in his throat. In 48 hours, he was supposed to stand on these grounds and marry a woman he didn't love, to absorb a territory he didn't need, to solidify a legacy built entirely on the bones of men like Jackie. Damien killed the engine. He sat in the dark of the garage, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned bone white. The empire he had inherited and expanded suddenly felt like a cage closing in on him. He couldn't do it. He couldn't play the game anymore. The estate was crawling with parasites. That was the only word Damien could find for them as he walked through the grand foyer at 9 in the morning. Florists were carrying massive arrangements of white orchids. Caterers were debating the placement of carving stations with a panicked event planner. A string quartet was tuning their instruments in the ballroom. It was a machine in motion, marching relentlessly toward the union of the Russo and the Calabrese families. Damien ignored them all. He walked straight past the event coordinator, who tried to flag him down with a binder full of fabric swatches and headed for the solarium. Victoria was there. She was sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, drinking black espresso while her assistant scrolled through a tablet. Victoria looked flawless. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. She wore a tailored white pantsuit, the very picture of mob royalty. "The champagne vintage is wrong," Victoria said as Damien walked in. She didn't look up from her espresso. "They brought the 12 instead of the 08. I told them if they serve the 12, I'll have their distributor's legs broken." The assistant nodded frantically, tapping away on the screen. "Leave us," Damien said. The assistant froze, looking between Damien and Victoria. Victoria waved a perfectly manicured hand, a silent dismissal. The assistant practically ran from the room, the glass doors clicking shut behind her. Victoria finally looked at him. Her sharp eyes immediately caught the dark circles under his eyes, the wrinkled peacoat he was still wearing from the night before. "You look terrible. Go shower. The photographer wants to do the pre-ceremony portraits at noon. There aren't going to be portraits," Damien said. He walked over to the glass table and placed his hands flat on it, leaning forward. There isn't going to be a ceremony. The wedding is off. Victoria stopped with her espresso cup halfway to her mouth. The silence in the solarium was absolute, save for the faint sound of rain hitting the glass roof. She set the cup down precisely on its saucer. It didn't rattle. She was entirely composed. "Excuse me?" she asked. Her tone wasn't shocked. It was dangerous. "I'm cancelling it," Damien said, his voice flat, resolute. "Pack your things. Have your security detail take you back to your father's house in Jersey. I'll send a courier this afternoon with the formal dissolution of the contract." Victoria stood up. She smoothed the front of her jacket, her eyes locked on his. The corporate mask slipped, revealing the ruthless predator underneath. "You are breaking a treaty, Damien. This isn't a high school engagement. You are breaking a pact between our families. My father will see this as an act of war." "Let him," Damien replied. He felt nothing. No fear, no hesitation. Just a cold, clarifying emptiness. "You're insane," she hissed, taking a step toward him. "You give up the docks, you give up the union contracts. The moment I walk out those doors, you lose 40% of your operational territory. My father will bleed your crew dry by the end of the month." "He can try." Damien turned his back on her. "Have your things out of here in an hour." He didn't wait for her to scream. He walked out of the solarium, leaving the wreckage of a multi-million-dollar alliance behind him. He went straight to his private office, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind him. He walked behind his desk, bypassing the encrypted phones used for syndicate business, and picked up a secure, untraceable landline. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. It belonged to a man named Arthur, a fixer who specialized in erasing people and money. A man who built ghosts. "I need an account zeroed out," Damien said the moment the line clicked open. "No names, no trail, and I need a medical trust established." For the next 2 hours, Damien dismantled his life. While Victoria's men angrily loaded her Louis Vuitton luggage into black SUVs outside his window, Damien was moving millions. He wired funds through shell corporations in the Caymans, laundering clean money back into the United States. He called the pediatric respiratory clinic in Queens. He paid Toby's $40,000 debt in a single, anonymous wire transfer. He didn't stop there. He contacted the chief of pulmonology at Mount Sinai, a man whose gambling debts Damien owned. He called the debt in, demanding a permanent VIP room and around-the-clock care for a 5-year-old boy named Toby Davis. Finally, he called Frank. His lieutenant walked into the office 10 minutes later. Frank looked tense, his hand resting instinctively near the holster under his jacket. News of Victoria's departure had already spread through the ranks. "Boss," Frank said, closing the door. "The Calabrese boys are mobilizing. We got reports they're pulling their guys out of the Brooklyn warehouses. They're gearing up. Let them take Brooklyn," Damien said, staring out the window at the rain. "Pull our men back to the core territories. I want absolute defensive postures, no preemptive strikes." Frank stared at him, bewildered. "We just hand them the borough? Damien, what the hell is going on? You just blew up the biggest alliance on the coast." "The alliance was a rot," Damien said, turning to face his lieutenant. "It's done. Have the gates locked down. Nobody comes in unless I clear it." Frank hesitated, chewing on the inside of his cheek. In their world, weakness was a death sentence. Backing down from the Calabrese family was blood in the water. "The men are going to talk, Damien. They're going to say you lost your nerve. If any man has a problem with my nerve, he can walk through this door and discuss it with me," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Are we clear?" "Crystal," Frank muttered, backing towards the door. "One more thing," Damien added. "The maid, Sophie. When she gets here for her shift, let her through the gates. Send her directly up here." Frank paused, his brow furrowing. But he knew better than to ask another question. He nodded once and left the room. Damien sat down in his leather chair. He looked at his hands. They were clean, manicured, unscarred. But in his mind, they were dripping with the same blood Sophie scrubbed off the concrete. The waiting room at the Queen's Clinic always smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. For 2 years, it had been Sophie's personal purgatory. She sat in a hard plastic chair, Toby asleep against her chest. The small oxygen tank was wedged between her feet, clicking a steady rhythm. She was exhausted. Her bones ached from the damp cold of the apartment, and her mind was racing with absolute terror. Damien Rousseau had been in her home. He had left $4,000 on her table. In Sophie's world, there was no such thing as charity. Money from men like Rousseau was a collar. It was a chain wrapping around your throat, pulling tight the moment you tried to walk away. She hadn't touched the cash. She had stared at it all night, terrified that if she moved it, she would somehow trigger a bomb. She was here to beg the billing department for another extension. She had planned to offer them double payments next month, promising to take on more night shifts at the estate. The door to the back offices opened. The clinic's lead administrator, a stern woman who usually looked at Sophie with thinly veiled pity, walked out. Her expression today was entirely different. She looked pale, shocked. "Ms. Davis?" the administrator said, walking over with a clipboard. Sophie immediately stood up, adjusting Toby's weight. "I know I'm behind, but I can pay $1,000 on Friday. I just need—" "You're not behind, Ms. Davis," the administrator interrupted, her voice hushed. "The account has been cleared, paid in full." Sophie froze. The blood drained from her face. "What?" "Not just the arrears," the woman continued, looking at the papers as if they might catch fire. "Everything. The future treatments, the medication, it's all been covered by an anonymous trust. Furthermore, we received a call from Mount Sinai 10 minutes ago. They have a private suite prepared for Toby. An ambulance is on its way to transfer him. Dr. Aris, the chief of pulmonology, is taking over his case." Sophie couldn't breathe. The sterile walls of the clinic seemed to warp and tilt. Mount Sinai, the chief of pulmonology. That wasn't just money, that was power. Pure, unadulterated, terrifying power. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Damien Rousseau didn't just buy her a collar. He bought the cage, the lock, and the ground she stood on. He had seen the one thing she cared about in the world, the one vulnerability she had left, and he had claimed it. She handed Toby over to a bewildered nurse when the private transport team arrived. She watched them load her nephew onto a specialized stretcher, surrounded by equipment she could never have afforded in 100 lifetimes. She didn't get in the ambulance. She told them she would meet them there. Instead, she walked out into the rain and headed for the subway. The commute to the Rousseau estate took 2 hours. By the time she reached the massive iron gates, she was soaked to the bone. The estate was strangely quiet. The usual bustle of black SUVs was gone. The caterers' vans were nowhere to be seen. The gates were locked tight, guarded by 3 men carrying assault rifles in plain view. When she approached, one of the guards raised his hand to stop her. Then his earpiece crackled. He listened, frowned, and stepped aside, pressing a button that opened a small pedestrian door in the iron gate. "He's in his office?" the guard muttered. Sophie didn't go to the service entrance. She didn't put on her shapeless grey uniform. She walked up the main marble steps in her wet jeans and faded jacket, leaving a trail of muddy water on the immaculate floors. Frank met her at the top of the stairs. He looked at her wet clothes, his jaw tight. He gestured down the hallway toward the heavy mahogany doors. Sophie pushed the doors open. The office was dark. The curtains were drawn, hiding the sprawling view of the manicured lawns. Damien sat behind his massive desk. He looked up as she walked in. He didn't look like the untouchable Mafia boss anymore. He looked exhausted, stripped raw. Sophie walked right up to the edge of the desk. She didn't shrink away. She didn't avert her eyes. She stared at him with a quiet, burning fury. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with absolute rage. Damien looked at her. He noticed the water dripping from her hair, the defiant set of her jaw. "I don't want anything from you." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, slamming her hand down on the polished wood. Men like you don't zero out $40,000 debts for nothing. Men like you don't call in favors at Mount Sinai unless you want to own someone. You came to my home. You looked at my nephew. Now you're paying his bills. I won't be your leverage. We are not for sale." Damien didn't flinch. He let her rage wash over him. He deserved every ounce of it. "It's not leverage," Damien said quietly. He stood up from his chair. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to spook her. He walked around the desk until there was nothing between them. "Then what is it?" She shot back. "Guilt. Did seeing a sick kid finally make the great Damian Rousseau feel something? You wipe up the blood of dozens of men, but one sick boy makes you open your wallet?" Damien looked down at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. "Jackie was short $20,000 on a collection," Damien said. His voice was devastatingly calm. Sophie froze. The anger in her eyes faltered, replaced by a sudden, terrifying confusion. She knew Jackie had owed money. She knew he had been killed for it. But she never knew the details. She never knew who pulled the trigger. "He begged for his life," Damien continued, refusing to look away, forcing himself to bear the weight of her stare. "He told me he needed the money for his son. He told me his lungs were failing. He told me everything." Sophie took a slow step back. Her breath hitched. The pieces were slamming together in her mind, forming a picture so horrifying it made her dizzy. "I didn't care," Damien said. The words tore his throat apart, but he pushed them out. "I ordered the execution, right downstairs, in the room you clean every night." Sophie didn't scream. She didn't attack him. Her face crumbled, the fierce armor shattering into a million pieces. She let out a small, broken gasp, stepping back until her shoulders hit the heavy wooden door behind her. "You," she whispered. The word carried the weight of 1,000 daggers. "Me," Damien confirmed. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He offered her the brutal, naked truth. "I killed your brother for $20,000, and today I just spent $2 million trying to buy back my soul." Sophie stared at the monster in front of her. The man who had orphaned her nephew. The man who had subjected her to years of grueling, silent torment. The man who had just saved Toby's life. She slid down the heavy door, her legs giving out, and wept. The sound of Sophie's weeping filled the cavernous office. It wasn't a delicate, quiet sorrow. It was the visceral, ugly sound of a soul breaking apart, tearing through the suffocating silence of the room. Damien stood, perfectly still. He didn't move to comfort her. He didn't offer a platitude. He just stood there and let her grief fill the space he had built with her brother's blood. He deserved to hear it. He deserved to have it etched into his eardrums for the rest of his miserable life. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Outside, the rain lashed violently against the heavy, reinforced glass of the windows, blurring the sprawling estate into a smear of grey and green. Finally, the crying slowed into ragged, gasping breaths. Sophie pushed herself up from the floor, her hands gripping the brass doorknob for leverage. She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, but the sheer, blistering hatred radiating from them was palpable. She crossed the room in 3 rapid strides. She didn't hesitate. She swung her hand and struck him across the face with everything she had. The crack of her palm against his jaw echoed sharply. Damien's head snapped to the side. He tasted copper. He slowly turned his face back to her, keeping his hands firmly at his sides. She hit him again. A closed fist this time, connecting with his cheekbone. "You monster!" she hissed, her voice jagged and broken. "You took him. You took the only thing Toby had left, and you made me scrub your floors. You watched me do it." She shoved both her hands against his chest, trying to push him backward, but Damien was a wall of solid muscle. He didn't budge. He just let her fight. "Hit me again," he said. His voice was utterly hollow. Sophie raised her fists, trembling so violently she could barely stand. But the energy suddenly left her. The adrenaline crashed, leaving behind a profound, terrifying exhaustion. She dropped her hands, wrapping her arms around her own stomach as if trying to hold her organs inside. "I can't," she sobbed, stepping away from him, her back hitting the heavy oak desk. "I don't have the luxury of killing you. If I go to prison, Toby has no one. You knew that. You knew I couldn't touch you. Toby is safe," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low, steady hum. "He's at Mount Sinai. He has the best care on the eastern seaboard. The trust is irrevocable. Even if I die tonight, that money is locked away for him. He will never struggle for oxygen, or a bed, or a future. That is done." Sophie stared at him, the rain still dripping from her damp clothes onto the Persian rug. "Why? If you're a butcher, then be a butcher. Why save my nephew? Why cancel your wedding? What is the angle, Rousseau?" "There is no angle," Damien replied. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured a glass of amber liquid. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the way the light fractured through the cut glass. "I spent my whole life building a machine. I thought the machine was necessary. I thought it kept order. But the machine runs on meat. It runs on men like Jackie. Yesterday I looked at that bill you dropped. I looked at a woman scrubbing blood off concrete just to buy another hour of air for a child. And the machine broke." He turned back to her, setting the glass down. "Victoria is gone. The Alliance is dead. The Calabrese family is currently pulling their soldiers out of Brooklyn and arming them. By tomorrow morning, this estate will be a fortress under siege. I burned my empire down, Sophie." Sophie shook her head, trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. "Because of me. Because of Toby," Damien corrected quietly. "Because watching you hold him through a crack in a door was the most real thing I have ever seen. Because I realized I am a dead man walking in a graveyard I built myself." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the desk between them. Inside there are passports, social security cards, and a deed to a property in Switzerland. Completely clean. No ties to the Rousseau family, no ties to the syndicate. The hospital in Geneva has a world-class pediatric pulmonary ward. They are already expecting a transfer from Mount Sinai by the end of the week. Sophie stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "You're sending us away. I am giving you a life," Damien said. "The Calabrese family doesn't know who you are yet, but they will look for my weaknesses. When they find out I cancelled a multi-million-dollar merger the morning after visiting a Maid in Queens, they will come for you. They will come for Toby. I won't let that happen." "And what about you?" Sophie asked. The words slipped out before she could stop them. She hated him. She should want him dead. But the man standing before her was dismantling his entire existence for a boy he didn't know. "I stay here," Damien said, looking toward the window. "I hold the line. I make sure nobody follows you." Before Sophie could respond, the heavy mahogany doors burst open. Frank stood in the doorway. His usual composed demeanor was gone. His suit jacket was thrown open, revealing the tactical vest he wore underneath. In his hand, he gripped a compact submachine gun. "Boss?" Frank said, his breath coming quick and shallow. "They didn't wait for tomorrow. The perimeter alarm on the south gate just tripped. We got 4 black vans pushing through the tree line. It's the Calabreses. They're hitting us now." Damien didn't flinch. He looked at Frank, then at the manila envelope on the desk, and finally at Sophie. "Take the envelope," Damien ordered, his voice hardening into the unforgiving steel that had ruled the underworld for a decade. "Frank is going to take you to the secure bunker beneath the wine cellar. You stay there until it's clear." "No," Sophie said, panic finally bleeding into her voice. "Toby is at the hospital alone. I have to go to him." "If you walk out those doors, you will be caught in the crossfire," Damien said, closing the distance between them and grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was tight, desperate. "You trust me for 1 hour. Just 1 hour. I will get you to your boy. Do you understand?" Sophie looked into his eyes. There was no deception there. There was only a terrifying, absolute resolve. The man who had ordered her brother's death was now offering his own life as a shield for hers. She gave a single, jerky nod. Damien released her. He reached under his desk and pulled a heavy Glock from a hidden holster, racking the slide with a sharp, metallic clack. "Frank," Damien said, tossing a set of heavy iron keys to his lieutenant. "Lock her in. If the house falls, you take the tunnel out. You get her to Sinai. You get them on the plane." "Damien!" Frank protested, his eyes wide. "I fight with you." "You follow my orders, Frank, or I'll put a bullet in you myself!" Damien roared, the true Mafia boss finally showing his teeth. "Get her out of here!" Frank swallowed hard, nodding. He grabbed Sophie's arm. As Frank dragged her toward the door, Sophie looked back over her shoulder. Damien was walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the rain-soaked lawn where black shapes were beginning to emerge from the tree line. He didn't look back. He was walking into the fire. The first gunshot shattered the heavy glass of the solarium downstairs. The sound echoed up through the marble hallways of the estate like a clap of thunder. Damien moved with a lethal, practiced efficiency. The hollow emptiness that had plagued him for weeks was gone, replaced by the cold, terrifying clarity of violence. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He wasn't fighting for pride, or money, or a shipping contract. He was fighting to buy time. He stepped out of his office and moved down the sweeping main staircase. The air in the foyer was already thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized drywall. Below, 3 of his men were overturned behind heavy oak tables, exchanging fire with a dozen Calabrese foot soldiers pushing through the shattered front doors. It was a massacre. The Calabreses had brought heavy ordnance, expecting resistance. What they found was a fractured crew, confused by their boss's sudden erratic behavior. Damien didn't take cover. He walked halfway down the stairs, raised his weapon, and fired. 3 shots, 3 bodies hitting the marble floor. The immediate threat paused, the remaining attackers scrambling for cover behind the massive marble pillars. Damien's men looked up, their eyes widening at the sight of their boss standing in the open, completely exposed. "Push them back into the rain!" Damien shouted, his voice cutting through the ringing gunfire. "Nobody steps foot in my house!" The rally was instantaneous. Seeing Damien fight like a man with nothing to lose ignited a desperate fire in his soldiers. They laid down heavy suppressive fire, forcing the Calabrese men to retreat toward the ruined front steps. Damien moved down the stairs, stepping over the shattered remains of a $1 million chandelier. He checked his corners, moving methodically toward the east wing. The estate was massive, a sprawling maze of corridors, but Damien knew every blind spot. He moved through the dining room, the same room where he had sat with Victoria just 24 hours ago, planning a sterile, loveless future. Now the silk drapery was shredded by bullets, and the mahogany table was covered in glass. 2 Calabrese men burst through the kitchen doors. Damien didn't hesitate. He dropped them both before they could raise their weapons. He kept moving. He had to draw their attention. He had to make himself the loudest, most dangerous target in the building, ensuring nobody went looking for a hidden door in the wine cellar. For 45 minutes, the estate became an absolute war zone. The pristine walls were painted with blood and soot. The deafening roar of automatic weapons tore through the silence of the secluded property. Damien fought like a ghost, moving through the hidden servant passageways, flanking the attackers, and systematically dismantling their assault. He was wounded. A grazing shot had torn through his left shoulder, soaking his white shirt in dark, sticky red. He didn't feel it. The adrenaline was a narcotic, keeping his focus razor-sharp. Eventually, the gunfire began to thin out. The Calabrese family had underestimated the sheer, brutal resilience of the Russo stronghold. Hearing police sirens wailing faintly in the distance, the surviving attackers began to fall back, dragging their wounded to the vans. Damien stood in the ruined foyer, breathing heavily, his weapon lowered. The silence that fell over the house was heavier than the gunfire. He had survived. He had held the line. But as he looked around at the destruction, at the bodies of his own men and the bodies of his enemies littering the pristine marble. He knew this was only the beginning. The Calabrese family would regroup. They would call in favors. They would hunt him until the end of his days. Frank emerged from the shadows of the west corridor, his face pale, his weapon still raised. "They're gone," Frank said, his voice raspy. "Cops will be here in less than 5. Damien nodded slowly. He looked at his lieutenant. "Is she safe?" "Lock tight," Frank confirmed. "Tunnel is clear." "Good." Damien walked over to the side table, miraculously untouched by the gunfire, and picked up a heavy brass lighter. "Get the men out of here. Tell them the Russo family is dissolved. They take whatever cash is in the vault, and they disappear. Nobody talks to the police." Frank stared at him. "Damien, what are you doing?" "I'm ending it," Damien said. He walked toward the drawing room, where the gas lines for the massive stone fireplaces fed directly into the walls. "You can't burn it," Frank argued, following him. "This is your legacy. This is your father's house." "My father was a parasite," Damien said coldly, tearing a heavy gas pipe from the wall with a brutal heave. The sharp hiss of natural gas immediately filled the room. "And so am I. There is no legacy here, Frank. Only a butcher shop." He moved to the next room, breaking the lines, letting the highly flammable gas flood the lower levels of the estate. "Get her to the hospital," Damien ordered, not looking back. "You get her on that plane. If I ever find out she was harmed, I will hunt you down in hell." Frank looked at the man he had served for a decade. He saw a man who had finally woken up. With a curt nod, Frank turned and sprinted back toward the wine cellar. Damien stood in the center of the foyer. The sirens were growing louder, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet trees outside. The smell of gas was overpowering, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled medical bill. He smoothed it out, looking at the final balance, paid in full. He struck the brass lighter. The flame sparked, bright and warm. Damien tossed the lighter onto the gas-soaked rug. He turned and walked towards the hidden servant passageways, just as the entire east wing erupted into a blinding, roaring inferno. The private suite at Mount Sinai was quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital were dimmed, replaced by the soft, warm glow of a bedside lamp. Sophie sat in a plush armchair next to the bed. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of harsh chemicals, were gently holding Toby's small hand. The boy was asleep. For the first time in his life, there was no rattling machine beside the bed, no oxygen tubes looping over his ears. His chest rose and fell in a steady, effortless rhythm, supported by medications and therapies Sophie couldn't even pronounce. He was going to live. Sophie looked at the manila envelope sitting on the small table next to her. The passports, the deed to the house in Switzerland, the escape hatch. She turned on the small television mounted on the wall, keeping the volume low. The morning news was dominated by a single story. Helicopter footage showed the smoldering, blackened ruins of a massive estate in Long Island. The pristine lawns were covered in fire trucks and police barricades. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Mafia stronghold destroyed in explosive blaze. Crime boss Damien Russo presumed dead." Sophie stared at the screen. The news anchor was talking about a brutal gang war, a collapsed syndicate, and the end of an era. She reached forward and turned the television off. A quiet knock on the door made her jump. She turned around, expecting a nurse to come check Toby's vitals. The door pushed open slowly. Damien stood in the doorway. He looked nothing like the untouchable billionaire who had ordered her brother's death. He wore a cheap, nondescript grey hoodie and dark jeans. His left arm was in a sling, bulked out by heavy bandages beneath the fabric. His face was covered in soot, a dark bruise blooming across his cheekbone where she had hit him. He looked exhausted. He looked mortal. Sophie didn't stand up. She didn't scream. She just looked at him, her heart pounding a heavy, complex rhythm against her ribs. "The news says you're dead," she whispered. "I am," Damien replied, stepping into the room and closing the door softly behind him. Damian Russo burned to death in his home. His teeth were identified in the wreckage by a corrupt medical examiner I bought off 3 years ago. He walked closer to the bed, stopping a few feet away. He looked at Toby. The hardened lines of his face softened, an impossible vulnerability cracking through his stoic mask as he watched the boy breathe on his own. "The plane leaves in 2 hours," Damien said, tearing his eyes away from the child and looking at Sophie. "Frank is waiting downstairs in a transport van. He will take you straight to the tarmac. The house in Geneva is stocked. The doctors are waiting." Sophie picked up the manila envelope. It felt incredibly heavy. It was a golden ticket, bought and paid for in blood and fire. "And you?" she asked. "I disappear," Damien said flatly. "I have a new name, a new face on paper. I go where the ghosts go." He didn't ask to come with them. He knew better. He knew that salvation didn't erase the past. You don't get to kill a woman's brother and then play father to her nephew just because you felt guilty. He had saved them, but he was still the villain of their story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted burner phone. He set it down on the table next to the envelope. "If the trust ever flags, if you ever feel unsafe, you press one," Damien said. His voice was thick with an emotion he refused to name. "I don't care where I am in the world. I will come." Sophie looked at the phone, then up at his bruised, soot-stained face. The hatred she had felt for him in his office had burned out, replaced by a devastating, complicated sorrow. He was a monster who had torn her life apart. But he was also the man who had just burned his entire world to ashes to put it back together. "You're really letting it all go," she said softly. "The money, the power." "It was never power," Damien corrected. "It was just a cage. You taught me that." He took a step back, retreating toward the door. He didn't offer a dramatic goodbye. He didn't ask for her forgiveness, because he knew he hadn't earned it. "Have a good life, Sophie," he said quietly. He turned the handle and opened the door. "Wait." Damien froze in the doorway. He didn't turn around immediately. He braced himself, expecting her to hurl one final curse at him, to tell him to rot in hell. Sophie stood up from the armchair. She walked over to the table and picked up the envelope. She looked at the burner phone sitting beside it. She walked up behind him. "Toby has to see a specialist in Zurich every 3 months for the first year," she said. Her voice was steady, grounded. Damien slowly turned around to face her, confusion knitting his brow. "I don't speak German," Sophie continued, holding his gaze. She wasn't offering him absolution. She wasn't offering him love. She was offering him a brutal, pragmatic reality. She was a woman alone with a sick child in a foreign country, and he was a man with a ruined soul who needed a purpose. Damien stared at her. The silence in the room stretched out, thick with 1,000 unspoken words. "I speak German," he finally whispered, the gravel in his voice breaking. Sophie didn't smile, but for the first time in years, the defensive armor around her eyes cracked, revealing a sliver of terrifying, fragile hope. "Then you carry the bags," she said. She turned and walked back to the bed to gather Toby's things. Damien stood in the doorway, the sterile light of the hospital hallway casting a long shadow into the room. He wasn't a boss anymore. He wasn't a killer. He was just a man, stepping out of the dark, finally learning how to breathe. What would you do if the foundation of your entire life was built on a lie? Damien chose to burn his empire to the ground to save the family he destroyed. This story of redemption, survival, and the heavy price of humanity proves that sometimes the greatest strength isn't holding on to power. It's knowing when to let it go. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a gritty, emotional drama, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories. What do you think happens next in Switzerland? Comment below.